island of the West Indies in the Caribbean. Here in the 17th century, the European powers fought for possession of tiny islands. Here in the 18th century, famous admirals fought great battles. Vernon, Rodney, Hood, and here Nelson served. But it was the slaves brought from Africa who were to endure, to inherit the islands, and also to remember the past. Kings and queens, great ladies and soldiers with white faces, and the man with a whip. The dancers of Jamaica prepare for carnival. In Jamaica, carnival commemorates a notable deliverance. It celebrates the day in Queen Victoria's reign when 500,000 slaves were finally set free. For the slaves, it was a day of rejoicing. But for the British Empire in the West Indies, it was a very different matter, because that empire had been built for 200 years on their labor. In 1624, a band of disappointed Englishmen, led by one Thomas Warner, came ashore from their ship in search of the unknown. They were on their way back from South America, where they'd tried to get a foothold on the Spanish Main and gain a share of the gold the Spaniards were looting from their colonies. Empty-handed, they landed on this beach on the island of St. Christopher in the West Indies. Together with Virginia, this tiny island was to become England's first colony, the start of the British Empire. St. Christopher was not a desert isle, as Warner soon discovered. An Indian people called the Caribs were in occupation. As well as artists, they were colonizers and cannibals. They were eating their way through their predecessors, the gentle Arawaks whom Columbus had first encountered. From the Spanish name for a Carib, caribal, comes our word cannibal. Barbecue is another word they gave us, and so is canoe. Though their canoes were to prove no match for the firepower of European galleons, the Caribs remained dangerous. Warner was lucky. The chief of the St. Christopher Caribs was friendly at first, and Warner even took a Carib woman as his mistress. It was she who warned him of a plot to kill him. The English struck first, with the aid of some French settlers. Despite the arrival of Carib reinforcements from neighboring islands, a fierce battle ended with their extermination. 2,000 are said to have been killed. Over 100 settlers, wounded by poison arrows, died stark raving mad within 4 hours. Soon afterwards, the French and English quarreled, and war broke out between them. Several bloody little campaigns were fought, and then a truce was signed. They divided St. Christopher, which is less than half the size of the Isle of Wight, between them. The French governor built himself a brick palace, a sort of tropical Versailles, surrounded by walls and terraced gardens. Today, this graceful garden staircase remains. From his garden, the governor looked out over the south end of the island, which was French. Also French was the north end, but the middle of the island was English. Near one of their churches was laid to rest Thomas Warner, now Sir Thomas, not only Royal Governor of St. Christopher, but also Lieutenant General of all the Caribbean Islands. For Warner's energy and bravery had led him to plant the English flag not only on St. Christopher, but on several neighboring islands, contending with other European nations in the rush to snatch them from the decaying Spanish Empire. Warner took Nevis, Antigua, Montserrat, and Barbuda. The Dutch took Statia, Saba, and shared half of St. Martin with France. The Swedes took St. Bartholomew. The Danes took St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas, which they shared with Brandenburg, Prussia. France also seized Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia. St. Vincent and Barbados went to England, and Grenada and Tobago went to France. Trinidad, just off the coast of South America, was held by Spain. Most of the larger islands in the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico and Cuba, remained Spanish, except Santo Domingo, half of which was seized by France, and Jamaica, which was conquered by a Cromwellian army to become England's largest Caribbean colony. The Caribbean Indians had introduced smoking to the Europeans, and tobacco was soon in great demand. Its cultivation brought rapid profits and a rush of settlers to the West Indies. Barely 15 years after a handful of English first landed on Barbados, there were 30,000 settlers on this small island. Some were noblemen and their followers, living in great stone houses, on estates granted by King Charles I. But many were small farmers on just a few acres. Nicholas Abbey was built about 1650 by bondsmen. They bound themselves to a master for 7 years in return for their passage from England and their keep. There were also convicts, who instead of being hanged were transported. Some were Irish rebels against Cromwell, or West Countrymen sentenced by Judge Jeffreys. Religious dissenters such as Puritans or Quakers also migrated to the West Indies. Like the American colonies, they became both a refuge and a dumping ground for Britain's social outcasts. Here on this Barbados estate owned by a Colonel Drax, a development took place which changed the whole future of the island, and indeed of all the West Indies. Around 1642, sugar cane, a kind of giant grass, was planted just as the boom in tobacco was ending. Its cultivation spread rapidly from Drax's estate to others, then from island to island, until it was almost the only crop grown. It was to bring in 1,000,000 times the wealth the Spaniards had got from their gold mines, Hawkins, Drake, and Raleigh from their pirate raids. Sugar was in demand to sweeten the new tropical drinks of cocoa, coffee, and tea. To supply the tea tables of Europe, endless wars were to be fought, millions of men to die. To grow cane and turn it into sugar needed large estates equipped with simple machinery, and it needed a large force of unskilled laborers. But the small tobacco farmers were being driven off the island to make room for the big estates. For their supply of labor, the big planters turned elsewhere, to Africa. For over 100 years, Africans had been brought to America as slaves. The first large-scale traders were Portuguese, but they were soon joined by other nations who set up fortified trading posts or castles on the coast of Africa where slaves could be collected. There were English and Dutch, Danish and Prussian, French, Portuguese, and Swedish castles. The slaves might be prisoners taken in tribal wars, or they might be criminals. They might have been kidnapped or sold into slavery. African chiefs and merchants grew rich on the trade, as well as Europeans. At the coast, slaves were medically examined and a price agreed for them, either in trade goods or coin, such as the English guinea, specially minted for trade on the Guinea coast. The slaves were then branded with the shipper's mark and loaded aboard. When a cargo was complete, the ship sailed across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, as it was called. The voyage could take up to 3 months. It was an ordeal for slave and sailor alike. The ships varied in size from 30 tons up to 400 tons. This is a typical loading plan, that of a Liverpool slave ship, the Brooks. She was 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. On the main deck below, men lay naked on the rough planks, shackled in pairs. Then came the boys, unshackled, 5 rows head to toe instead of 4. Then the women, girls, and children. More were packed in on a shelf round the side, 6 foot wide, cutting down the headroom still further. At the stern, a half-deck and shelf took more women. In all, over 600 slaves were carried. To move through the darkness across the deck to the latrine buckets, shackled slaves stumbled over others, giving rise to quarrelling and violence. Many preferred to ease themselves where they lay. Dysentery was often rife. On some ships, the decks were only cleaned once a week. On others, not at all. You could smell a slaver 5 miles downwind, they said. Seasickness and lack of air added to the suffering. In bad weather, hatches were shut. Slaves, women in particular, were at the mercy of the sadistic and sexual whims of the crew. A typical case was that of a Captain Kimber, who flogged a 15-year-old girl who refused to share his bunk. Another captain tossed a baby overboard because its crying disturbed his sleep. At least 10 million slaves were carried across the Atlantic, more than 2.5 million of them in British ships. 1 out of every 5 died on the way, of melancholia and suicide, of ill treatment, violence, and disease. And the sailors died too, more than 1 in 10. At the height of the trade, around 1790, most British slaves came to Jamaica to join the 300,000 already there. A seaport like Falmouth might be their first sight of land after a 3-month voyage from Africa. Here they were put up for sale. £60 was an average price for a man, 55 for a woman, 50 for a child. They were then marched off to a plantation. Of the 700 sugar plantations in Jamaica, one of the largest, near Falmouth, was called Good Hope. Its layout was typical. Surrounded by cane fields and pastures, at its heart were the main buildings. On a hill at the top stood the planter's great house. Down the hill were a storehouse and office, a house for the overseer, cottages for the other white workers, such as bookkeepers and craftsmen, the village where the slaves lived, the sugar works, with its watermill for crushing cane. In 1790, the owner of Good Hope was John Tharp, born in Jamaica and educated in England at Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge. From modest beginnings, Tharp built up the most profitable estate of his time. As an old man in his wheelchair, crippled with arthritis, he looked out from his balcony and knew that all the land as far as the horizon was his. From here he could also see his overseer going the rounds of the estate. An average estate was 300 acres with 300 slaves. Tharp owned 3,000 acres and 3,000 slaves. He was constantly putting up new buildings, improving old ones. All his work bears the mark of an ingenious and thorough mind. From his estate he could expect an income of £50,000 a year, £250,000 present value. In the sugar works, the main building was the boiling house. The plantation was a factory as well as a farm, and the slaves followed a year-round routine with no let-up. part industrial, part agricultural. The hardest work was preparing the fields for cane planting with a heavy iron hoe. Children over 6 marked out the rows, or weeded and collected grass for the animals. Into the holes went sections of cane, from which new shoots would grow. The gangs were supervised by trusty slaves known as drivers. They used cattle whips to spur on the work. The slightest indiscipline could lead to brutal flogging. New cane took about a year to ripen. The crop was cut in the spring. It was the busiest time of the year. It took 3 years to break an African tribesman into an efficient field slave. It was known as the seasoning period. 1 in 3 of the slaves died during seasoning, of disease, overwork, ill treatment, and suicide. They worked from dawn to dusk, with a short break for breakfast and a longer one at midday. Though the work in stifling cane fields was back-breaking, crop time seemed the best in the year to the slaves. Then at least they could stave off hunger by chewing cane, and they were even given rum to keep them going. Slaves were expendable. The planters reckoned it more economic to import new slaves from Africa rather than prolong the life of those they had by better treatment. The life expectancy of a slave was 7 years. Once cut, the cane had to be crushed quickly. Otherwise, the juice from which the sugar was made would spoil. So a continuous supply of cane was brought to the mill, where it was fed into iron rollers to crush out the juice. Even more powerful and reliable were water mills, common in Jamaica where there is a heavy rainfall. On his estate at Good Hope, John Tharp had a river to drive his 6 water mills. They kept slaves working day and night during crop time. From his main mill on one bank, the cane juice was channeled across to the other, and then into the boiling house. Inside, the juice was boiled in a series of coppers, impurities being ladled off at each stage, getting more and more concentrated. In the last copper, it became liquid sugar and was then channeled into cooling trays. The sugar was put into casks and left for weeks, while the molasses dripped out of it. The molasses were distilled into rum, the other great product of the islands. The ruins of the buildings where the slaves worked may still be seen today. The villages where they lived and died have left little trace. The village site at Good Hope is typical. On rough, swampy ground scattered with palm and breadfruit trees, the fruit that Captain Bligh of the Bounty brought from the South Pacific to the West Indies to become a staple of the slave's diet. Heaps of stones may also be seen. Foundations of the slave huts, basically the same as those still lived in all over the islands. Made of wattle and daub, or wood, they were thatched with palm or cane trash, their one room furnished with an iron pot and a few wooden bowls. Most slaves slept on the ground. Slaves weren't allowed to marry, Some couples formed lasting unions, but these could be broken by one partner being sold elsewhere. Men far outnumbered the women, and promiscuity was inevitable. The infant death rate was enormous. Abortion was common. More than half of those born never reached the age of 4. Slaves were expected to grow their own food on plots of marginal land. They worked them on their one day off. And where land was too precious to spare from cane growing, their masters imported food, especially from the American colonies. The slave diet was mainly vegetable, with an occasional ration of salt fish or meat, notably at Christmas. In good years, fruit was plentiful. In hurricane or drought years, or in wartime blockades, thousands died of hunger. If they produced more than they ate, they were allowed to take the surplus to the Sunday markets. They'd walk up to 20 miles to get there. These markets were a rare occasion for meeting fellow tribesmen, relations and friends, for gossip and quarrels. Money that changed hands was the only regular means with which the slaves could buy extras and perhaps save a little. On rare occasions, a slave might persuade his master to sell him back his freedom. Even the whites came to rely on the Sunday markets for certain provisions. And after the market, the slaves could play. Cudgeling and wrestling were popular with the men, a reminder of their warrior past. But dancing was the chief recreation. Dances were often forbidden by their masters. They were lewd. They were associated with voodoo, oath-taking, and rebellion. For the fear and threat of rebellion was never far from the planters, as they sat on their hilltops, outnumbered 10 to 1 by their slaves. The great house was usually on a hill for defense, and to catch any breeze blowing. 2 stories was the rule because of earthquakes and hurricanes. Roofs were of cedarwood shingles. Inside there were no ceilings over the living rooms. In this way rats were kept out and air moved freely. Wooden slats were common in windows instead of glass. The best silverware and china were imported to grace their tables. 4 posters were universal, often carved by slave craftsmen. Hurricanes did enormous damage. When they raged, master and household slaves huddled together in special rooms. This one was spur-shaped and projected into the prevailing wind. Houses like Rose Hall were obviously built by men of creative energy, but the caricatures of the time show planters as ridiculously provincial, coarse in manners and on the make. A sort of stripped cartoon character of the day was Johnny Newcomb. In one series, he arrives in the West Indies to seek his fortune. He begins as bookkeeper on an estate, keeping tally of stores. Having learnt to handle slaves, he becomes an overseer. At a ball, he meets the planter's daughter, woos her, and eventually wins her hand. In another version, Johnny sets up a harem of black and mulatto women, common practice where white women were rare and slave women freely available. Many planters, like John Tharp, added mulatto children to their legitimate white ones. They were often endowed with wealth and education by their fathers. Many were made legally free, but had no political rights. They tended to live in towns, with the women much sought after as mistresses by high officials. In death as in bed, planters shared a common humanity with their slaves. But the masters were remembered, and the slaves were not. Masters found the half-pagan Christianity of the 18th century easy to reconcile with slave-owning. They believed that the Bible sanctioned slavery, that Africans were better off as slaves in contact with a higher civilization than living in their heathen and brutish homeland. The benefits of that contact were limited, however, since slaves were not allowed in Anglican churches, and baptizing them was discouraged. For teaching them to write, you could be fined £100. Parishes were also the centre of civil administration, and small towns grew up round each church, as at Falmouth. Here John Tharp and his fellow planters came down to do business, to dispatch their sugar and rum, to buy slaves. Here they came to pay their taxes. Here they kept their town houses. This one belonged to the family of Edward Moulton Barrett, who retired to Wimpole Street in London. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth, eloped with the poet Robert Browning, whose family also came from the West Indies. In the courthouse, planters could shed the loneliness of the plantations and mingle with their fellows, with officers of the garrison and navy. Here they held their assemblies and weddings and their balls. Spanish Town was the social as well as the political and military center of Jamaica. "20,000 white men and 300,000 slaves were ruled by the governor of Jamaica from this splendid house. The governor represented the king, but his powers were often a mere facade. He was hampered and opposed by the Island Assembly, in which John Tharp sat. It was a parliament exclusively of planters and their supporters. They made the House of Assembly a bastion for their privileged position based on slavery, even in defiance of the English king and parliament. Equally partisan were the law courts. No slave could give evidence against a white man, so it was almost impossible for a slave to obtain redress for injuries. A white man could torture and kill slaves with impunity, provided there was no white witness prepared to testify against him. In law, slaves were defined as chattels or real estate. In plantation ledgers, they were listed with the cattle. Like cattle, they could be bought and sold, mated, and separated at the will of their master. Their children would also be slaves forever. Like cattle, they were branded with their master's initials. They were herded and driven to work under the lash of a cart whip. For misdemeanors such as lateness at work, the law allowed up to 30 lashes without the need to go to court. But this was widely exceeded, and many slaves died under the lash. On one island, 60 slaves were flogged and tortured to death in 3 years by a planter called Hodge. For misdemeanors, slaves who'd worked throughout the day might be put in the stocks all night. Iron masks were used to stop them eating dirt, of which many died. Planters thought this a form of suicide, but it was more likely due to malnutrition. Collars were put on slaves going off the estate on an errand, or as a punishment. Runaways could be shackled to crippling weights. Pilfering, shirking work, sabotage, and running away were the main forms of slave resistance. Newspapers of the time are full of advertisements for runaways. To recapture them, savage methods were sometimes used. Rebellion, anything from striking a white man to armed conspiracy, was punished by mutilation and death. As late as 1760, death could be by slow burning, or they might be hung up and left to die of exposure and starvation, put out to dry, they called it. Profits from plantations were enormous. By law, sugar and rum could only be sent back to Britain in British ships. In 1790, a quarter of Britain's overseas trade was with the West Indies. It was known as the triangular trade. Cloth, guns, and other goods were sent from Britain to Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves at a profit. These were shipped across the Middle Passage to the islands and sold at a profit. The ships then loaded sugar and brought it home to make a third profit. The trade helped to make Bristol the second city in England. Prosperity spread from the harbour to sugar refineries, distilleries, chocolate factories, and ironworks. By 1790, Liverpool had overtaken Bristol and London as the biggest slaving port. It grew from a fishing village into a city in 50 years. They said at the time that every brick was cemented with the blood of a slave. London was the financial centre of the trade as well as a slaving port. The West India dock was built to hold over 100 sugar ships at a time. When planters had made their fortune, they came home to join the landed gentry. With the money he made at Good Hope, John Tharp bought Chippenham Park near Cambridge. The estate covered more than 20,000 acres, including 2 villages and their churches. He became Deputy Lord Lieutenant of the county and went into politics. He married his eldest son to the daughter of an earl. As in Jamaica, Tharp kept busy about his estate. He made improvements to the cottages of his tenants and to the village school. He built a large new stable block and laid out 6 acres of gardens. He got James Wyatt, the famous architect, to design the gates. Wyatt also worked for another client, William Beckford, said to be the richest heir in England. His father owned about 20 estates in Jamaica and came home to become Lord Mayor of London. In 1796, the family seat in Wiltshire was turned by Wyatt into Fonthill Abbey. It cost £300,000, equivalent to £1.5 million today. It became a showplace of European renown, where Beckford Jr. received Nelson and many other famous visitors. Another showplace was Stowe, which belonged to the Duke of Buckingham, who also had an estate in Jamaica. By the end of the 18th century, there was scarcely a great family which did not have some connection with the West Indies and its wealth. Perhaps the most successful family in terms of social advancement were the Lassalls, who owned this estate in Jamaica, as well as others in Barbados. They came home to Yorkshire, to Harwood House, and a peerage. A Jamaican heiress brought her fortune to prop up Lord Holland, and from Holland House in London presided over the most glittering literary and political circle of the day. With their wealth, the homecoming planters bought seats in the unreformed House of Commons, just as they bought themselves into the landed gentry. In the House, they made sure the West Indies' interest was always well promoted. In particular, they made sure that the defense of their islands came first in any war. The protection of the British Sugar Islands became a chief task of the Royal Navy, and as the 18th century progressed, it won supremacy over the Dutch and Spanish navies, and finally over the French. A key factor in this success was English Harbour, the naval base on the island of Antigua. This was almost hurricane-proof, and gave a British squadron shelter during the hurricane months, to be ready for instant action when the campaigning season began. At the dockyard, there were facilities for repairing and refitting ships of the line. There were sailmakers' lofts and mast houses, stores for rope and canvas and clothing, for food and water, gunpowder and shot. There was a wet dock and a huge boathouse with a roof resting on pillars 12 feet round. There were giant capstans for hauling down the ships so that their keels could be scraped clean. Generations of English sailors served here. Pressed into service and torn from their families, they were in some ways worse off than slaves. They, too, could be forced to serve for years until totally disabled. They, too, were subject to rigid discipline, enforced by the lash. Yet sailors had one advantage over slaves, a fierce pride in their calling and their country, which in battle raised them again and again to heights of anonymous heroism. Even in peacetime in the West Indies, they died in great numbers. They left one useful memorial. Just outside the dockyard, there's a water catchment with a cistern underneath. Villagers still use it more than 200 years after the Navy built it. Here sailors used to gather in the cool of the evening. Many carved their names on the wall, and those of their ships, their mates, and their hometowns. The admirals who won victories in the West Indies became household names. Benbow, Vernon, Rodney, Hood, all fought here. So did the greatest of them all, Nelson. In 1779, as a young captain, he commanded the batteries at Fort Charles, Jamaica, during the War of American Independence. A French force of 25,000 men was heading for the island. On the seaward side there were two gun decks, the lower one and the upper, still known as Nelson's quarterdeck. As he paced it, keeping watch for his country's enemies, Nelson knew what he was defending. I was bred in the good old school and taught to appreciate the value of our West India possessions, and neither in the field nor in the Senate shall their just rights be infringed, whilst I have an arm to fight in their defense or a tongue to launch my voice. Like all naval officers of his time, Nelson believed the slave trade was the foundation of England's wealth and a nursery for her sailors, that if England did not dominate it, some other nation would. In 1784, Nelson came to English harbour as captain of the frigate Boreas. He was 25. As senior captain, he took command of the squadron. Part of the time he had to spend ashore, which he hated. I am alone in the commanding officer's house while my ship is fitting, and from sunrise until bedtime I have not a human creature to speak to. The moment old Boreas is habitable, I shall fly to it, in order to avoid mosquitoes and melancholies. Nelson was often ill, but typically he kept his men healthy and cheerful with exercises and dancing. In 3 years, not one died. One of the junior captains under Nelson's command was Prince William, George III's son. It was a delicate situation for Nelson. The prince built himself a house on the hill above the dockyard, from where he threw himself into plantation society. All his life he was to remain an ardent supporter of the slave trade. It seems he also adopted another local custom. He called her Wowski the Mole. When distinguished company came aboard, she dived discreetly below deck. Nelson often dined here in the prince's house, though he disliked following the prince in his wilder escapades. The prince admired the austere but promising young captain in whose affairs he was to play a decisive part. On a visit to the island of Nevis, Nelson met a young widow, Fanny Nisbet. Fanny was the orphan niece of a rich planter, John Herbert. She lived with him at his great house, Montpelier. From the garden, Fanny could watch eagerly for Nelson's frigate to put into Charlestown harbour. Nelson's attachment to Fanny and her infant son grew, but being penniless, he obviously hoped that her uncle would give her a rich dowry. But uncle was not very forthcoming. The courtship might have gone on indefinitely had not Prince William announced that he graciously wished to give the bride away, and since he was leaving, the wedding had better take place soon. It did, within 5 days. The couple were married in the shade of this silk cotton tree in Uncle Herbert's garden on March the 12th, 1787. Afterwards, they signed their names in the register at the local church. Three months later, Nelson and his bride sailed home on separate ships. He was not to return for almost 20 years. By then, he would be world famous and on the eve of his greatest exploit. In protecting the West Indies, the army played a vital, if less spectacular, role. Part of its job was to prevent slave risings, so most towns, such as Falmouth, had small barracks where soldiers might rot for years at a time, seeing little action but enduring much squalor, damp, and disease. A West Indies posting came to be regarded as a death sentence. The largest fortress in the West Indies was Brimstone Hill on St. Christopher, or St. Kitts, standing on the old frontier between the French and British sections of the island. Even after the whole of St. Kitts had become British, Brimstone was extended until it became the Gibraltar of the West Indies. big test came in the War of American Independence. After the final defeat of the British Army by Washington at Yorktown, the French fleet, supporting the rebel colonists, concentrated on the Caribbean. It landed 8,000 men on St. Kitts and besieged the British garrison of 900 men. Under heavy bombardment, they held out for a month before being forced to surrender. Their stand gave time for the main British fleet under Rodney to reach the West Indies and join forces with Hood's squadron. On April the 12th, 1782, they caught up with the French fleet off the islands of the Saints. The battle was as large as Trafalgar, yet it is almost forgotten. 37 British against 30 French ships. For the first time, Rodney broke with the practice of fleets sailing along in parallel, exchanging broadsides. At great risk, he cut across the enemy line and threw it into confusion. It was the same tactic Nelson was to use at Trafalgar. At the Saints, it proved its worth. Close-range British gunnery was overwhelming. Among the 5 ships captured was the French flagship, the Ville de Paris. Only 3 of her crew were still on their feet, one being the French admiral. The Ville de Paris is carved on the monument which the grateful citizens of Jamaica erected to Rodney. But Rodney had not just saved Jamaica from conquest. He had removed the French fleet from American waters and thus made easier that peace with honor which brought an end to the disastrous War of American Independence. But peace was to be short-lived. In 1789, the French Revolution began. Its effects spread to the French West Indies, where slaves were declared free. In the largest colony, Haiti, freed slaves rose up and massacred thousands of planters and mulattoes. Napoleon sent an army to recapture the colony and reintroduce slavery. His army was defeated in a merciless war with atrocities on both sides. By 1793, Britain was once again at war with France, and once again a large force was sent to the West Indies, where the British planters feared a rising by their slaves. It was the first of several such expeditions. Thousands of men from Britain, year after year. The British troops took Martinique, where Queen Victoria's father, the Duke of Kent, led several brave attacks on the French forts. They took Guadeloupe and Tobago. They took Trinidad from Spain and Demerara from Holland. The British also took and retook St. Lucia, which had changed hands 10 times in 100 years. The price was enormous. In 4 years, 40,000 British soldiers died, some in battle, but most of yellow fever. On St. Lucia, 4 military governors died within a few months of each other. This is their memorial. Altogether, more died in the West Indies than in the Peninsular War, where Wellington, as a result, was always short of men. These are the most forgotten armies in British history, the last tribute of blood to the West India interest. Nelson completed their task by destroying the French fleet at Trafalgar, at the cost of his own life. In Trafalgar Square in Bridgetown, Barbados, the planters put up this statue 40 years before the one in London. They had reason to be grateful. The slave trade became a British monopoly, and all the enemy islands fell into British hands. Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Lucia, and Tobago from France, Trinidad from Spain, and Demerara from Holland. British sugar production boomed, but the boom didn't last. The plantations depended on slave labor and protection from competition in the British market. Both these supports were about to be removed. Men like William Wilberforce, moved by a revival of Christianity, stirred up public opinion against slavery and demanded its abolition. Thomas Clarkson opened the eyes of the British public to the sufferings of African slaves. "Am I not a man and a brother?" ran the slogan on the abolitionists' campaign emblem, made by the great potter Josiah Wedgwood. As part of the campaign, people were asked to boycott slave-grown sugar from the West Indies and buy East Indian instead. This was produced more cheaply, but cost more in Britain because of the protective duty levied on it in favor of West Indian sugar. Humanitarians joined East India merchants in demanding the removal of the duty. Free trade was in any case to become a general demand as the Industrial Revolution gathered speed and Britain developed into the greatest manufacturing power of the Victorian age. New industries, new markets, and new territories in the empire were thrusting ahead. The importance of sugar in Britain's trade was getting rapidly smaller. King Sugar was ending his reign, and King Cotton beginning his. All these new demands and interests were reflected in the British Parliament. In 1807, the House of Lords led the way in making the slave trade illegal for British ships and in British colonies. In 1825, the import duty on some East Indian sugar was reduced to the same level as West Indian. And in 1833, the reformed House of Commons decreed the end of slavery in the British colonies. In the West Indies, 500,000 slaves rejoiced on the great day. But as the slaves rejoiced, the economic collapse of the plantations was already underway. With their ruin, the West Indies ceased to be the most prized jewel in the imperial crown. The new Star of India was rising in the east.